Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll get our feet wet in what Winston Churchill once called the most critical battle of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic. And of course, the main part of this struggle for mastery of the seas was waged on the German side by submarines, the famous U-boats, who did their utmost to strangle Britain and win the war for Germany. Hi Jesse, here we are again, another week, another episode. Today a slightly wet one, so we're looking at a Navy topic. We haven't done a lot of naval stuff, so it's really time that we looked at some wet topics. And I think before we actually start talking about the U-boats, so the famous grey wolves, the embodiment of German, well, if you want to call that naval might, I'm not quite sure if that's the right word here, because they are quite small. I think perhaps a bit of a disclaimer before we start, because the Germans obviously were not the only ones to use submarines. And of course, they didn't invent them either. So can you shed some light on this, perhaps?
Well, that's true. I mean, yes, the German submarine arm of the Navy has become, iconic, not only in its historical importance for the struggle for control of the North Atlantic logistical routes, but of course also in pop culture. Everybody listening out there, I'm pretty sure we all know Das Boot, either from the original movie or from, I think they remade a new series about it, which I haven't seen.
Don't watch it, it's awful. Just listen to the techno song. Das Boot.
We used that for one of our outro jokes on a YouTube video one time. Well, you can see then the drama and the pop culture presence if we even have a serving military officer wearing a very conservative, for those of you who can't see us, of course, a very conservative sweater and collared shirt who's miming techno music. You can see the drama, the appeal of the idea of the U-boat. And of course, this is what makes them famous. It's the most famous part of the naval war in the Atlantic anyway. But yes, Matthias, you're right that we have this little footnote at the beginning that, of course, the Germans are not the only ones who have U-boats. In fact, the Allies make very extensive use of their U-boat fleets in the Second World War to great effect, especially, and in some ways, as a Canadian, it's hard to give credit to the Americans, but I'll have to put my national pride to the side because the American U-boats, the American submarines, I should say, really played an absolutely critical, some say decisive role in the Pacific theater. So, yes, we're going to talk about the Germans. No, we're not assuming that they were some sort of U-boat magicians, that nobody else was doing this or that nobody else was doing it effectively, because it's just not true. And in particular, of course, the U.S. submarine arm is one of the unsung heroes, I think, of the Allied war effort. So, close bracket on our little tip of the cap to the Allied submariners. And now, back to the Germans.
So let's have a look at what the Germans are doing in this Battle of the Atlantic. And I think we need to, as we always do, rewind a little bit, take a step back and have a look at the historical context, the strategic context, and everything that shapes, in this case, the Battle of the Atlantic. So if we perhaps spend 1 or 2 minutes on the First World War, because this is the first time that you really see U-boats, submarines, and I shall be using the German term now, U-boat rather than submarine, because it does sound better. So this is the first time you really see them in action. And by the standards of the day, these little metal beasts, these little tubes, are reasonably well established. They are well designed. They are full of, by that stage, modern technology, and they work quite well. So the Germans, of course, using the U-boats trying to starve Britain into submission, which doesn't work. And we all know the story, I hope. If not, listen to our sister podcast on the First World War about how unrestricted U-boat warfare brought the US into the First World War. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the First World War as such, but it's just the important thing, the important lesson here is that in World War II, you have a means here, you have a weapon, let's call it a weapon, which have been tried and tested. And if you look, for example, at Dönitz, who's the head of the German U-boats, all the way to the end of the war. And then, of course, he becomes the last head of Germany. Most people don't even know this. So Hitler appoints him as his successor, and he is now the head of Germany. He runs the country. Well, not really, because he then surrenders to the Allies, but he's the last head of state. Yeah, it's about a week. That's pretty much it. Again, a different story, but quite an interesting one. So Dönitz had served as a U-boat commander himself in the First World War. So again, he understood these things. He knew how these things were done. And then, of course, with the end of the First World War, you go into the Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty restricts pretty much everything to do with the military for Germany, including U-boats. They're not allowed to have them. So what do the Germans do? Well, they basically outmaneuver the treaty because a number of German companies and firms get into bed with Dutch companies and firms that, strangely enough, are producing U-boats. And they basically have a joint venture. And so the Germans have got access to the technology, even though technically, officially, there still is no U-boat arm and U-boat force. So that perhaps is the context. You might say they're cut off from this, at least to a degree. And they need to play catch up. And they do this after 1933, because in 1935, Germany signs a naval pact, a naval agreement with Britain. And that then leads, the next step, to a very, very famous plan, and that's called the Plan Z. Can you tell us a bit more about Plan Z and what that means?
Yes, for our American listeners, one might pronounce it Plan Z. But of course, for our Commonwealth listeners, it's Plan Z. And this is a pre-war, longer-term German naval building program. And even though we're talking about U-boats, they get short shrift, according to Plan Z, because I think it was meant to be fulfilled by about 1948 or so.
Yep.
And the idea was to focus on the surface ships. So in the German military, the Navy essentially is the younger brother, so to speak. So, or maybe the neglected stepbrother. I don't know how you would want to phrase that, but it's certainly beneath in terms of influence, in terms of prestige, competing for resources, especially in those early years of rearmament where there's not as much to go around. The Navy is definitely the third of the branches of the service after the Army, which is head and shoulders above everybody else. Matthias, you'll be happy for me to announce that yet again. And then, of course, the Air Force. So the Navy is the third in rank, so to speak. So the idea of building a powerful surface fleet where you can have raiders causing havoc in the North Atlantic, causing problems for the Royal Navy, this is kind of one of the centerpiece aspects of Plan Z. And the submarines are there. There are plans to build quite a few of them. If memory serves, something like over 200, but they're not really the main focus of it. And so by the time, war breaks out, the Navy feels that it's not ready. Its surface fleet has not been built out to the extent that it was planned, what it wants to do, what it hopes to do. And there are only 39 U-boats ready for service at the start of the war, which is definitely not enough. And I'm going to skip it over to you, Matthias, to flesh that out. But before I do, I want to read a quick quote. Now, Dönitz was head of the U-boat arm, but the head of the Navy as a whole, at the start of the war anyway, was a different admiral. Raeder was his name. And he was fairly pessimistic, I guess, about the Navy's chances at the beginning of the war, and he sums it up here in this little quote that I'm going to read out. As far as the Navy is concerned, obviously it is in no way very adequately equipped for the great struggle with Great Britain. The submarine arm is much too weak. The surface forces, moreover, are so inferior in number and strength to those of the British fleet that even at full strength, they can do no more than show that they know how to die gallantly. So when your boss is saying that the best you can do is die gallantly, the strategic situation is not quite what you would want it to be.
Yes, so it is dire, isn't it? Everybody knew this. The very limited number of surface ships that they had can't match the Royal Navy. They had a much larger navy again in the First World War. It didn't work. So there is nothing they can do. So die gallantly, die with honor is the only thing that the German Navy can do. They might have adopted a slightly different approach, one that the German Navy actually is adopting right now. Whenever you have a German Navy delegation visiting the UK, it is customary that everybody takes a little pebble and then throws it into the sea. So the idea is that after about 1,000 years or so, having collected enough pebbles, Britain will just disappear and sink into the sea. So it's a bit of a joke there, but there we go.
Grand strategy.
Grand strategy, long-term planning, absolutely. But you're absolutely right. When you look at the numbers, so this plan that they had, that they come up with, and so that they want to set into motion, calls for 249 U-boats. Now that sounds like a lot. When you look at some other nations, they weren't quite there, but other nations actually have far more U-boats than the Germans. The British have more U-boats, particularly the Japanese have more U-boats. Also, the Italians, they've got about 100 at that stage. And you already mentioned a number. So when the war breaks out, the Germans have in total 56 U-boats. Numbers differ. You said 39. Sometimes you read 46 operation at the outbreak. It doesn't really matter what the exact number is. I think the lesson here is there aren't a lot of U-boats to go around. If you then think, or whether you then know that of these, let's say 40, only 22 had enough range to go into the Atlantic, because this is the early days of the war. So German U-boats have to go around Britain. They can't use the ports in France. We'll get to that later on. So it's very, very difficult. Only 22 of these can actually reach the Atlantic and do what they need to do, i.e. sink ships in that area. If you then understand that normally only a third of the U-boats would actually be available to do the hunting in the sea, because another third is on the way to the area of operation or going back, and another third is either getting refitted or on training missions. So there is only a handful of U-boats in 1939 that the Germans can actually send out. And you can see why at that particular stage, no one really thinks that the U-boats can make a huge difference. The numbers are really, really far too low. And yet what happens, it's interesting that you have a number of, you might call it propaganda coups very, very early on. So for example, in September 1939, a German U-boat U-29 sinks a British aircraft carrier. It's not a modern one. It's a former battle cruiser. It's the HMS Courageous that have been decommissioned. It's then been brought back into service. It's turned into an aircraft carrier. So it's not the most exciting one at that particular time. But still, it's an aircraft carrier. It's better than what the Germans have, because they have exactly zero. The Graf Zeppelin was never finished. So they sink this in September 1939, so shortly after the outbreak of the war. So that's a big propaganda coup, you might say. And then, of course, the real big one, that is in October 1939, where U stands for U-boat, Unterseeboot, undersea boat. That's the official translation. U-47, commanded by the very then famous commander Günther Prien, manages to find its way into Scapa Flow, into the British home naval base. That in itself is a huge achievement, because you've got all sorts of nets there, you've got currents, it's very, very difficult to get in. The story itself is fascinating, so when he comes back, he writes a book about that. A number of films were made about this. Most of them are not particularly good, but nevertheless, it is fascinating. So they get in there, they're expecting to see the entire home fleet. However, the entire home fleet isn't there, just one old battleship. They fire a torpedo, or a number of torpedoes. Once just hits the anchor line, explodes. They think they've been detected, but no one cares, because no one thinks that a German U-boat could get into Scapa Flow. While they're on the surface, there's a car going past and the light shines onto the U-boat. They think they're detected, panic strikes, nothing happens. because, again, no one thought a German U-boat could be there. In the end, they managed to sink the old battleship, and then they get out again. And that's also the fascinating thing, because getting out was even more difficult than getting in. So Prien comes back, and he now is the great hero of Germany of the autumn of 1939. So from a pure navigational skill aspect, absolutely astonishing what they achieved. They want to achieve even more. They want to sink more ships. That doesn't happen. But from a propaganda point of view, are really, really important. You can see how this then also internally, already at this stage, begins to shift a little bit the view in Germany. Jesse already talked about material and raw material and resources. That really is a problem. And building a big battleship, you can build a lot of tanks for that. So there's this constant struggle. And suddenly they say again, well, the U-boats, they're doing fine, aren't they? So maybe we need to switch a little bit. As long as Reda is still in power, it doesn't really happen, because he is more of a surface fleet man. But you can already see how things are changing and things are happening.
Well, I think one of the early war trends that sort of changes the character of the German war effort at sea is also what happens to the surface fleet. Because even though the surface fleet was never what the Germans wanted it to be, they did have some powerful weapons at their disposal. Some so-called pocket battleships, and, they had a fair handful of useful destroyers. But by the spring of 1940, much of that's gone. They lose the Graf Spee, for example, in this famous engagement at the end of 1939. Then when they invade Norway, they lose a whole bunch of destroyers. So what little there is of the surface fleet isn't really available. And it doesn't make sense, as you say, about resources. It doesn't make sense to pour resources into building more surface vessels. It's way more efficient to put them into the U-boat arm. On the other hand, the U-boat arm is also having some growing pains in this early period of the war, where they score some spectacular successes. They do sink about 700,000 tons of Allied shipping by the end of 1939. So it's not peanuts. It's definitely not enough to, have an impact on the course of the war, let's say. They also run into some technical problems. And this idea of technology is pretty central to how the U-boat war is going to play out. Once things get rolling and there's more resources going into both sides, this back and forth of technological leapfrogging, attack technology, defense technology, detection technology, it's something we're going to revisit several times over the course of this episode. And the Germans in this early period have a big problem with their torpedoes, which is a lot of them don't work properly. So they have a couple different models that show these problems. Sometimes they explode too early. Sometimes they don't explode at all. Sometimes they can't keep on target. It's so bad that Dönitz himself estimates that over 300,000 tons of Allied shipping was spared just because of faulty German torpedoes. Now, eventually, and our British listeners will be very happy to hear this, eventually the Germans maybe it's bittersweet from the British point of view, but the Germans try to find some solutions to these flaws in their torpedo technology by copying British solutions for the technology. So they do improve their torpedoes. But even so, by the middle of summer 1940, as far as what I've read, they still only have something like 55 to 60 operational U-boats. That is definitely not enough to get the job done. And we're already 1 year pretty much into the war. The British, of course, have introduced their convoy system right away from the beginning. So that's already going to give them something to work with, some kind of strategic and operating procedures. So that's kind of fixed. And the Germans are trying to work out, how do we build up our submarine arm and how do we solve some of the problems we have? Before I ping pong it back to you, Matthias, for your sense of all this, the Type 7 U-boat also comes along, which is a very important one. This is a larger model and it has much greater range. So that really allows the U-boats to extend their range, as does the Fall of France. because now they can have bases farther down the Atlantic coast. So that's kind of where we are up until, mid 1940. You have these different developments happening, some technology, some based in production problems, before the real U-boat war even really gets started.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so much there that we can unpack further. Well, each of these areas you mentioned is probably worthy of a podcast all of its own. So, just maybe go back to one or two of the aspects. So, first of all, torpedoes. Yes, that really is the big problem that the Germans have at that particular stage. There are numerous reports, for example, from the operation against Norway, where the entire U-boat fleet is sent out, including training U-boats and half-trained crews. And they are supposed to line up and sink Allied ships, and they practically sink absolutely zero. They fire lots of torpedoes, but they simply don't explode when they're supposed to explode. And that causes a massive crisis, as you can imagine. And also, well, it basically just makes the U-boat crews ask questions themselves. So why are we going out there? Why are we risking our lives when we can't even sink other ships? So what is the point of doing all this? So it's a massive, massive crisis that they're facing in all sorts of different areas when you look at this. As you said, eventually they overcome this. It does take some time. And they go through different iterations of different torpedoes. So they come with all sorts of technical solutions, as you already said. They then more or less nick a British design. It gets very sophisticated if you jump ahead a little bit. So when you look at the end of the war, you have torpedoes that can automatically zigzag, so trying to increase the chance of hitting ships in convoys. But that's at a later stage. At this stage, it really is a bit of a problem. And yes, the numbers are still not there. That's another big problem. So they keep sending out these boats, but you have to go around the UK before you can get into the Atlantic Ocean. At this stage, they are also not doing what you expect of U-boats, so basically just firing torpedoes submerged, but they're actually following the rule of war. So if you have a merchant ship in front of you, they would come to the surface, at least in theory, make it possible for people to get into their dinghies, their lifeboats, get away, and then you sink the ship. Again, that comes with all sorts of potential issues. It takes a long time. What happens if they fire back? If it's, for example, a Q ship, these were famous ships that the Allies had that looked like merchant ships, were merchant ships, but then equipped with weapons. So basically U-boat killers, U-boat hunters, you might say. So all sorts of issues and problems that you find there. And yes, the seven class, the most famous one, the 7C U-boat, which becomes the backbone of the German U-boat fleet, the very, very iconic one, going back, for example, to Das Boot. Whenever you've seen a German U-boat in action, I put money on it. It's going to be a 7C class, because that's the image of the German U-boat. If you want to see a 7C U-boat in all its glory, you need to go to Laboe. Laboe is on the Baltic coast, and there you have the memorial to the German Navy, which was built in the interwar period. And after World War II, right next to it, they put the last remaining 7C U-boat. So if you want to feel like a U-boat commander, go there and you can climb around and have a play around and see how small these things actually are. If you're used to perhaps more modern submarines, so they are palaces compared to what these boats, because that's what they were. Boats were not particularly nice to be on these. And then you already said the magic word, and that, of course, is France, the fall of France. The fall of France in 1940 changes practically everything for the U-boats and the U-boat commanders, because you just need to look at the map. Suddenly, you don't need to go through the North Sea, around Britain, perhaps even through the Channel. Most of them won't do that because you have too many mines, but you can go to the Atlantic ports in France and go from there into the Atlantic. And you can already, just without really understanding too much about how this war is conducted, just by looking at the map, you see this is an absolute game changer. So what happens then? What do the Germans do in the Atlantic? Jesse, back to you.
Well, they enjoy what is called the happy time, essentially, for a little while, because by mid 1940, the stage is kind of set for the classic U-boat war. So the main phase of the Battle of the Atlantic is going to be from the second half of 1940 41, 42, into the first part of 1943. That's when this massive struggle that Churchill accorded such importance to is taking place. With the Type 7, with the bases on the French coast, the U-boats are now really in a position to start doing some damage. And they also notice some vulnerabilities and take advantage of some of those vulnerabilities on the British side, right? So there's what's called a mid-Atlantic air gap, or mid-Atlantic gap tout court sometimes, where at first the British escorts are not able to have the range to go all the way across. Surface escorts, so warships, are not able to go, not all of them are able to go all the way across with the convoys. And then you have also a gap in the Allied air coverage in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And now the German U-boats can reach these areas. And that's why this latter half of 1940 is sometimes called the happy time from the German point of view, of course, because they can really unleash. They don't have as many boats as they would like, but they can really unleash against the British merchant vessels and cargo ships. And they score several spectacular successes again against several different convoys. One of the worst cases from the Allied point of view is a convoy, from memory, I think it was SC7 in fall 1940 out of Sydney, Nova Scotia. Shout out to Nova Scotia, by the way. 20 ships are sunk. And you get these U-boat aces as well developing out of this. They can really take advantage. They have experience. They've been in the Navy for several years. They've been commanding U-boats for several years. You mentioned Prien, I think, but there are others like Schulze, Kretschmer. They become stars because they sink dozens of ships out of several important convoys. So you have this happy time. But the main victims, interestingly enough, are not convoy ships, but ships that are still sailing independently. So not all ships are sailing in convoys at this time, and those are still the easy pickings for the Germans, so to speak. So you do have some high-profile successes, but the convoys, they're not useless. They are serving their purpose. They need to be improved. The British still have some issues with their escorts, for example. They have some trouble with inter-escort communication. They don't have enough radar to go around. The escorts will get a little trigger happy and rush off, leave the convoy and chase the mirage that there might have been a periscope somewhere out there, which then leaves the convoy vulnerable. So there's a bit of a back and forth. The Germans are doing some damage, but it's not yet mission critical, even though it is a happy time for them. They sink 1.1 million tons of Allied shipping in this 4 or 5 months of happy time. So it's a lot, but it's not yet something where the British are, on the verge of starving or anything like that. So I find this is a bit of an underappreciated phase, let's say. And I'm an amateur here. I should be quite frank about that. I'm not a boaty person whatsoever. Don't really like boats. Don't really like the ocean. But the second half of 1940 and the happy time, I think, is always worth a second look. I find it's an interesting phase.
It is absolutely right. And there's a reason why the Germans call it the happy time, the happy phase, the happy days. And one of the reasons is again, the strategic change that you can see happening. Because when the Second World War breaks out, of course, Britain, just like in the First World War, declares the blockade. And says no shipping is supposed to be going into Germany because it worked very well in the First World War. So we're trying to do the same thing again. So now that the Germans have access to the Atlantic, they actually declare their own blockade against Britain. And they do that on the 17th of August, 1940. And so they identify an area which is pretty much the same area which the Americans are no longer entering, because the American president had said, well, you're not allowed to go into a specific area because it's too dangerous. And the Germans say, okay, everyone that's now in this area, with the exception of clearly identified neutral ships and also hospital ships, can be sunk without warning. This whole idea of having to get up to the surface to then engage with the ship, let them get into the boats, then probably use the artillery to sink them, which takes time, which is quite difficult, if they manage to get a message across, so you might perhaps get attacked. All this goes away, and they can just do what U-boats are designed to do, and that is fire torpedoes and sink these ships. So again, you also have a strategic reason here why this changes and why the Germans are so successful. It's also now the phase where the new torpedoes are very, very slowly coming in. They're still using some of the ones that are not really working, but you now have a new generation, and so at least it's not solved this problem, but they can see a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, which of course really helps them as well. And yes, the other big point, of course, is the fact that you can now go from France, the big U-boat bunkers that they build there, mainly with forced labor, or the Organisation Todd, which normally did not use forced labor, but actually paid people to build these. When you go to places like La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, even today, in some of these you still see them, because basically, even after the war, they were so big and so well built that the Allies couldn't blow them up, so they just kept them there as a memento, you might say, of the history of World War II. And that, of course, really changes the game in this particular phase. And then, of course, we go to the second phase, and that is 1941. So what happens there? What changes?
Well, I mean, the British are doing their best to improve, and they're introducing improvements. They train special escort groups in tactics. So you want to have, I mean, crew skill and crew performance is another critical aspect of this naval war, right? So you want to make sure that your captains and your crews, but especially your captains, I would say, know what they're doing, that they're well trained, that they can cooperate with others, and that they have some experience, that they can get some rest, and so on and so forth. This is an area where these two tracks of the Germans and the Brits, well, Brits and Canadians, and then later Americans, are going to start diverging. Not yet, but they will into 1942-43, let's say. And the Brits train these specialized escort groups. They start to equip the ships with more and better radios, with more weapons. They dedicate more aircraft to the theater. And they get a little help from the neutral Americans because, well, this is still in late 1940, but it starts to really, what impact it does have comes after that is the destroyers for bases deal, where the Brits are kind of short ships. The Americans have a bunch of old destroyers from the World War I and older period that they've kind of mothballed, that are just sitting around, not doing anything. And so they agree to swap 50 of those destroyers for use of some British bases in the New World, in Newfoundland, in the Caribbean, and I think also in South America. And so that provides at least a few more numbers to the British to be able to try to improve their chances. But the U-boat arm is getting better. And I don't want to jump ahead here, but they're going to have a real bonanza in late 1941 when the US joins, because it's in no way prepared for the U-boat war. But I don't want to jump too far ahead without giving you a chance, Matthias, to catch us up on a few of the grand lines of 1941, other than what I've just talked about.
Well, in some ways, it's a continuation, at least the early months of this happy period. However, this then more or less comes to an end. You already mentioned a number of reasons. I'll come back to a few others later on. And there is one episode, one incident that really hammers home to the Germans that something is not going well. And that is in March 1941. On one day, the German U-boat arm loses its three great, let's call them heroes for a better term. And that is Strohn, we already mentioned him, the guy who managed to get into Scapa Flow. That is another chap who's very famous at the time, that's Schepke. And then you've got Otto Kretschmer, you already mentioned his name. Otto Kretschmer sank 44 ships, including one enemy warship, and he remains the most successful U-boat commander of World War II. That is interesting when you think about the fact that he's the only one to survive of these. And he is captured in March 1941. Again, that shows you a lot about these happy days, the happy times. We could just go out hunting and sinking ships. A very interesting character. He then spends the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp and then rejoins the German Navy after World War II and gets to the rank of, well, Commodore. That's basically where it gets to. So really interesting. So you can see I wouldn't say there's a big, massive change, but it's not least from a propaganda point of view. Oh, what's going on here? And they all die basically on the same day. And no one really knows, for example, how Prien was killed. And there is an argument that he was actually killed by his own torpedo. Again, coming back to this fault with the torpedoes, that he fired a torpedo. It was a sound torpedo, and it basically just detected the sound of his own submarine. So it went round in a big circle and hit his own submarine. No one really knows, but this is one of the explanations that people have brought forward, because also on the Allied side there is no report. Normally would say, well, sank a U-boat or whatever, engaged a U-boat. And there isn't anything. So that makes it really, really quite confusing when you look at this. The other thing you talked about, the US, that's also interesting because the US are getting now more and more involved. And we did a podcast about the US entry into the war, where we talk about this in much more detail. So I can keep it relatively short here. But we have this zone that the Germans have declared as the blockade area. And no one is supposed to go in there because you might get sunk. The Americans, to cut a very long story short, first of all, adhere to this. Later on, they say, no, we are protecting the convoys. And at this stage, the US is still a neutral country. And there are a number of incidents where, first of all, the Germans, for example, spot an American warship, the USS Texas, in this area. And that's on the 20th of June, 1941. As a consequence of that, the Germans say, okay, back off. We're not engaging these ships, so stay away from them, let them pass through, that's fine. But then in July, for example, the US president announces that US warships are to engage German U-boats in this area, and they're supposed to attack them. And he repeats this order in September 1941. And it's interesting, on the 4th of September 1941, a German U-boat, U-652 for the real spotters if you're interested, was attacked southwest of Reykjavik, of Iceland, by the US destroyer USS Greer. It's a very, very famous incident. So water depth charges are dropped on it, and the Germans fire torpedoes in retaliation. You might say, interesting enough, if you want to play this game, from this moment onwards, Germany was at war with the US. And of course, the Germans would have said it's US aggression. And this is actually an incident that Hitler officially uses as an explanation as to why he then declares war on the US in December 1941. So you can see there's things happening at the strategic level, the political level, but also there is a lot going on at the level of technology, because the Battle of the Atlantic is to a large degree a war of technology. We always have this idea of, well, these bearded people sitting in their U-boats and going out there and dashing through meters of waves. Yes, of course, that happens. But this is not really what decides the outcome of this particular battle. And we see it later on when we move into 1943 even more. But you can already see how the tide is beginning to turn now in 1941. So the British are getting better sonar and ESTIC, as they would have called it. So it's much easier for them to spot U-boats when they are submerged. You already mentioned the sheer increase of numbers, so they're having more of these destroyers, corvettes, all these different ships that they need to protect the convoy. So that gives them an advantage. And of course, the big thing that everyone's always heard about is the Enigma. So that's the German secret machine for secret messaging. The code had been cracked beforehand, so there's again in itself a very interesting story. But the Brits had issues and problems cracking the U-boat codes. It's far more technical than that, but I want to keep it simple here. And it's only when the British managed to basically get their hands on one of these Enigma machines in a U-boat, because they basically seize a U-boat, and the Germans want to sink it, but it doesn't go down. So there's raiding party goes on there, and they find this, and so that means from late spring of 1941, the British were actually able to more or less read all the messages being sent from, for example, Dönitz, the BDU, as he was called, BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, so commander of the U-boats, out to the U-boats. To begin with, it took about 40 hours to really crack these codes, but they could do it. And 40 hours is perhaps not such a long time if you need to send a U-boat several hundred or thousands of miles towards a convoy. And this is now the time where also the German U-boat commands are beginning to think, hang on, what's going on here? So we're still not being attacked because we still have this area that's not covered, but we can't find ships anymore. What's going on? Where are the convoys gone? And of course, this is because the British are reading the German radios traffic, and they basically navigate their ships, their convoys around these wolf packs that the Germans are now beginning to form. Again, they'll become more prevalent later on. But whereas in the early days, when you didn't have many U-boats, they would normally be, independently operating and the sole hunter. And now you get more of these together, really trying to overwhelm the security cordon around the convoy. So you can see there's a lot happening even in 1941. And you can already see how this very happy time is becoming a slightly more unhappy time for the Germans. However, then something happens, and that swings the pendulum right back into, you might say, the Germans' favor. Jesse, what is that?
Yeah, it's the US officially entering the war, because the US is in no way prepared for this type of naval war in the Atlantic, not from the naval tactical point of view, although they do have some experience. As you mentioned, they have been escorting some convoys on behalf of neutral protection of merchantmen and so on. But for example, on the eastern seaboard, where you have all sorts of ports and all sorts of ships coming and going, and now they're a belligerent, at first there's not even like blackout orders. So you still have lights shining from the cities out over the harbor and so on. So the Germans end up in a second happy time, which they sometimes call the American shooting season, starting from December 1941 and moving into 1942, where they can prey on all these completely unprepared American and other ships and along the eastern seaboard of the US. So it's another operating area for them as well. It's a bit farther away, which creates some logistical challenges for the Germans, but nonetheless, they set records in 1942 for the amount of tonnage that they sink. Dönitz in 1940, he estimated that they need to sink at least 300,000 tons of British shipping a month to have a real significant impact. But they barely reached that. In all of 1940 and even into 1941, they're having trouble reaching their goals. Well, in early 1942 and through 1942, they have a lot more success. They sink over 700,000 tons of shipping, for example, in November 1942, which is their best month of the war. So that's some serious progress. And some of that is due to, the unpreparedness of the United States, but some of it is due to German skill and ingenuity as well, we have to say. Not only are they adopting, as time goes by, these wolf pack tactics where they have larger groups of submarines concentrating on convoys together, but they also do some code breaking, and they are able, for a time anyway, to read one British naval code, if memory serves, and someone out there will know better than me. I think it was code number 3, cipher number 3. And that allows them to get into this game of cat and mouse again, with the British trying to route the convoys away from known positions, thanks to Enigma cipher cryptology. Whereas then the Germans are trying to locate those convoys via their abilities to break certain codes. And of course, then they do change things up. The Germans do with Enigma, which causes the Brits problems. They can't, uninterruptedly read German code throughout the entire war. There are periods where they need to wait for Bletchley Park to figure out what the new code is on the Enigma machines. So the U-boats then, of course, take advantage of these gaps. So at the same time as the very long-term trajectory is favoring the Allies, there's still a lot of opportunity for the Germans to do a lot of damage, in particular in 1942.
And of course, the numbers are going up now as well. That's important, because the Germans have now realized how important the U-boats are, far more important than the the surface ships, because, as you said earlier, most of them have been sunk by this stage. So the Bismarck isn't there anymore, the Graf Spee isn't there anymore. All the other ones are hiding somewhere in fjords and harbors. So it's just like, again, the First World War, a bit of a waste of effort in many ways. And so they're putting all their eggs now into the U-boat basket. And by the end of 1942, there are 210 German U-boats in operation. Again, if you take one third, it's not as impressive as it might look, but that's a big increase to 1939. So they can do more with this. And they're also now having different types of U-boats. Yes, the main and standard U-boat at this stage is still the 7C. They're beginning to develop even more advanced ones, but they come into service later on from 1943 onwards, and really only 1944 and particularly 1945. But now, for example, they're also developing support and perhaps you might even say cargo U-boats, because they know that when you send one of these 7C class U-boats all the way to the east coast of the US, it will run low on oil and other supplies quite quickly. So they have these let's call them cargo U-boats, which they call Milchkühe, milk cows, that were basically just there to provide the other U-boats with more torpedoes, more oil, fresh food, all these things. So you can see how all of this, in the German case, also becoming slightly more sophisticated, you might say. So yes, really happy time. Dear listeners, if you're interested in this, well, again, just on YouTube or wherever, or just type it in, German U-boats, East Coast, America, you can actually see how they are there. You can see very famous pictures, for example, that German U-boat commanders took through the periscope, showing you the skyline of Manhattan in the spring of 1942, totally illuminated. As you said, Jesse, no precautions taken. So this really is the best time for them. And when, at least in the harbor area of North America, the Coast Guard and the US Navy then start patrolling and start protecting the ships, they simply go into the Caribbean, and they start sinking ships there. At this stage, so from 1941 onwards, Dönitz had also been forced to send some U-boats into the Mediterranean. He didn't want to do this, but Hitler insisted, because he said that was kind of the counter move to the British sinking the German and Italian supply ships as they go into North Africa. That's a complete disaster. So the Germans lose more ships or more U-boats in the Mediterranean than they sink enemy ships. The water is too shallow, it's too clear, so it's too easy to spot the U-boats from above. All sorts of reasons why it doesn't work. Dönitz want to do that. He wanted to send all of these U-boats to the east coast of America. Hitler said no. So that, you might say, in this particular period, perhaps is the only thing that doesn't go particularly well for the Germans. Apart from that, it really, really is the happy time. But if we move on in our chronology, we're now getting into 1943, and in many ways, now the pendulum swings back again, and now for good. It will not swing back in the Germans' favor. And 1943 really is the watershed of the Battle of the Atlantic. So, Jesse, what goes on in 1943? Why does it change?
Well, as the Americans might say, the first half of 1943 is where the rubber meets the road. So it's where a lot of these developments that long-term you would think are sort of to the Allied advantage kind of come home to roost in a way. Although it doesn't look that way at first. That's one of the interesting things about history is you can't see into the future, and some trends are only really visible more clearly in hindsight. It's one of the reasons why everybody struggles to predict current events, and Lord knows there's enough of them these days. But in March 1943, for example, the Germans sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping. That's a lot. That was a big jump over what they had sunk in February 1943. So on the one hand, you can say, well, this kind of looks like a crisis. Things are getting bad. After all these German successes in 1942, here we have them spiking again in numbers of tons sunk in March 1943. But a lot of these Allied advantages really start to tell as of 1943 as well. And the turning point is then reached in March, April, May, in particular in May, but we'll get to that in a moment. So I like to think of it as it's a sort of a death by 1,000 cuts type of situation. If you look at it from the German point of view, the Allies keep introducing more and more improvements, and it's harder and harder for the Germans to keep up with the numbers involved, but also the technology and the tactics. One of the areas where the Allies start to really close the gap, literally and figuratively, is in the air. Because there is, as I mentioned, this big gap in the middle of the Atlantic where air cover could not reach for several years to help those convoy escorts and bomb U-boats or detect U-boats as they were traveling on the surface when they weren't in action or trying to go through the Gibraltar Straits or what have you. They close that by using very long-range bombers. And at first, they have very few of them. But as 1943 progresses month by month, they get more and more. The B-24 Liberator is a famous model that contributes to this. Of course, most bombers, are trying to bomb Germany or bomb Japan, but they manage to have enough left over that they can close this air gap in the Atlantic, which is fairly significant. Then there's that technological side. And of course, listeners, I'll remind you here as a humble caveat, I am also not a naval technology person, but there are a number of improvements that start to become routine, that start to come online and be present in most, if not all, of the convoys that together make the U-boat's job extremely difficult. This I find is interesting in the way that different weapon systems interact with each other, because you might have a weapon system that can do one thing some of the time, and then a totally different system that can do another thing some of the time. But if you have enough of those, that pattern of coverage, that pattern of capabilities is going to cover what you need it to cover. And that, I think, is kind of what happens here. The British, as you mentioned already, have sonar, also known as ASDIC. They develop what the British call HFDUF, which is high frequency direction finding. Don't ask me to get into more technical detail than that, but that allows escort ships to detect the Germans and ascertain where they are, how far away are they, what direction are they going. And this allows the Allies to be a bit more active and not as reactive. Oh, they also have a new small radar system, a 10-centimeter radar. So what they can do is locate the U-boats before they're an immediate threat and take action against them. So there's a way for the Allies to kind of punch back preemptively, so to speak. And this starts to tell in the numbers. In 1943, some people say there's a crisis, right, with these big numbers of tonnage that gets sunk. But at the same time, only about 30% of the convoys are being attacked at all. So 70% of the convoys sail right through. Now, there are some that lose quite a few ships, but if you compare it to late 1942, more than 50% of the convoys were being attacked at that time. So you can see that all these different capabilities are starting to come together, and the numbers are telling against the Germans. Even though they have this last kind of massive month in March 1943, the scales have tipped against them.
And the reason for that is, as you said, to a large degree, technology and what happens in the air, because the Germans and the Allies are playing this cat and mouse game. And up to this stage, the Germans were able to either attack ships on the surface, so do not go beneath the sea, because that's where the ASDIC hides. Or if that's what you want to do and go beneath the sea, that's exactly what you could do. So you could have different options. But now with the air being covered by these long-range bombers, this advantage goes away. And it's really telling when you look at how the Germans tried to react to this. So when you go into 1939, to begin with, in the outbreak of the war, the Germans were trying to do, you might say, typical U-boat warfare. So you spot a ship somewhere, you get relatively close, then you dive, and then you fire a torpedo and sink it so they wouldn't see you. This then changes, particularly when you get into the wolf pack tactics. So the way this works is that one U-boat finds a convoy. It then keeps contact with the convoy, but doesn't attack, but just gets the information back to where Dönitz sits, so basically Berlin and or France, where the U-boats are, and they would bring all the other U-boats onto this particular convoy. And then most of the time, these guys would attack during the night while they're surfaced. So they're not attacking while they're submerged at all because, well, first of all, you're much faster. You can use your diesel engines rather than your electric engines. You're more maneuverable. You get a better view, and you're less detectable because the moment you're on the surface, the SDIC doesn't work, the sonar. That only really works the moment you go submerged. So the problem then is, of course, when the Allies then close this air gap, that you're now faced with the air threat. And again, the Germans tried to react to this. And to begin with, they, for example, even put some anti-aircraft guns, relatively big ones, onto the U-boats. And they say, well, you shouldn't, when you get attacked by an Allied bomber, do not try to dive because it simply takes too long. Well, make sure that you engage them. That doesn't go down well at all, and it doesn't really work. And a lot of the U-boats get destroyed. But you can see how they're trying to, now the Germans react to the Allied actions. And you already mentioned some of the numbers. You can really see how this changes. So March 1943, you have, perhaps you might say, the last really big success of these wolf packs. Because you have 3 of these wolf packs, in total 43 U-boats. So that's a big number. And they're attacking 2 convoys, SC-122 and HX-229. So when they attack, they actually manage to sink 22 ships. So that is a big, big number. And they damage another 9 here. But this is also the very last time that this happens. As you already said, in May, everything changes. And the Germans then, in May alone, lose 43 U-boats. And as a consequence of that, Dürer pulls all the U-boats from the oceans, brings them all back to port and says, you know what, we need to have a look at what's going on here. If we continue like this, we simply can't win this anymore. So we need to come up with new ideas. At the moment, we are losing, or actually we have lost the battle for the Atlantic. So what's the solution? What is it that we can do? And from a German point of view, again, they try to do some technology and advancement in technology, but you can see how they're really beginning to play catch up now. So the big invention that they're now using is actually not a German invention, it's a Dutch invention from the interwar period. It's a snorkel. So basically you get this thing out, you can now have your U-boat below the surface for a longer period of time. But because you've got the snorkel, gets fresh air, and you can use your diesel engines rather than your electric engines. But that is, you might say, in many ways, the most advanced innovation that the Germans can come up with. If you compare that to what the Allies are doing at that time, it's not particularly good. They're also developing now new types of submarines, of U-boats that are very different, because up to this stage, U-boat really is a surface boat that is able to dive for short periods of time. The moment the batteries are empty, you have to come up. This is also the way how you try, if you're British or American, how you try to destroy or defeat a U-boat. It's not necessary that the depth charges are supposed to break the U-boat in 2 parts, but just keep them submerged for long periods of time, several hours. Then they will either all die down there because they simply don't have any oxygen left, or the engines fail, or they will have to come up. So this is what you do. But this new generation of U-boats, they're slightly different now. So they're more designed to spend more time below sea and submerged. You can see at the very, very end, I'm jumping ahead slightly, where you have, for example, 2 U-boat commanders that are using these very, very new ones to sail submerged from Germany all the way to South America, where they then surrender when the Second World War is already over. So they're trying to do something, but they're very, very much playing catch up, and you can see that at this stage, I would argue the war is already being lost. I mean, I can throw some numbers at you. So in 1943, 287 German U-boats are lost. This is about double the number that they'd lost from the outbreak of 1939 all the way to the beginning of 1943. So you can see there really is a change. There is a shift. And there's something is really happening. Whereas the tonnage that they sink is plummeting. So in 1943, it was only 3.5 million tons. And that's far less than what the Allies can produce now, because they're mass producing. And then it goes down and down and down. So in 1944, it's about 1.5 million and more than 240 sunk German U-boats. So you can see from 1943 onwards, the pendulum really does not swing back in the Germans' favor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that really happening from this April-May 1943 period. You mentioned in May alone, they lost 43 U-boats. This is why some U-boat crews referred to it as Black May. And this is sort of the last hurrah of the experienced U-boat commanders, because if you look at the war as a whole, if memory serves, I don't have this stat in my notes, and I'm working from memory here. I think something like 30,000 of 40,000 German sailors who served in the U-boat arm during the war died. I mean, that is an absolutely unholy rate of loss for any situation. But of course, especially when, it's tricky to use a U-boat. You've got to have a lot of skills. You've got to have a lot of experience. And the more of those experienced commanders and crews that you lose, your performance then on the battlefield, so to speak, then decreases exponentially. It's a bit like air crew or pilots, fighter pilots, a similar type of dynamic. Those experienced commanders, some of whom we mentioned from earlier in the war, in the earlier phase, they accounted for a proportion of losses inflicted on the British, all out of proportion to their numbers. And now you don't have those. Of course, the tactics devolved to these group wolf pack tactics, but still, if you don't have enough captains who know what they're doing, it's going to be a lot harder to do your job. And of course, then you have this death by 1,000 cuts. I wanted to say earlier, because we hear so much in the context of today's wars, in particular the war between Russia and Ukraine, about game changer this and game changer that. In a big, long war, game changers are a very, very rare thing. And I think this is a good example of that. There's lots of very interesting technological developments that we might want to grab onto as, oh yeah, this was the one invention that turned the tide of the U-boat war. Well, I hope, listeners, you're getting the impression that, as usual in history, it's a little more involved than that. And so you have this air power, you have naval tactics, and you have various different measures and countermeasures of technology, plus the intel from the code breaking, all coming together. And on the balance, it's then in the Allies' favor. I mean, aircraft account for 1/2 of all U-boat losses, which I think is something that, from a popular history point of view, you don't necessarily get that impression. It's really escorts versus U-boats in a lot of the public memory, let's say, of the war, but the aircraft play a very, very significant role.
Yeah, so when you look at the consequences, you've already mentioned them, you've already given some of the facts and figures. Maybe to sum up, to just throw out a few more facts and figures at the audience here. Say the German U-boats sink around 3,000 Allied ships. That's about 2,800 merchant ships and about, roughly speaking, 200 warships, slightly under. So that's impressive, but it's not enough. Particularly when the US enter the war, they've got a very big shipbuilding program. So from that point onwards, even though, yes, you have the happy days, you can see even there, are you going to win this game in the long run, yes or no? And on the other hand, you can see, you already mentioned it, about 27,000 German U-boat crew die. And that, let's face it, is not a very nice way to die. Other nations also have very high losses in percentages when it comes to submariners. For example, the US is another good example here. Japan as well, the Italians. The British, I think, is slightly smaller, but simply because the British submarine fleet was used in a slightly different way, more to protect sea lanes than to go out and really hunt, because the Germans didn't have that many ships out there. So it's very, very simple. But that's a very high blood loss. So 27,000 out of around 40,000. That is really nasty. And as you said, it's in particular the second half, which generally speaking is the big killer. In every war, once you have used up, for a better phrase or a better term, the experienced troops, and you just throw these people into the meat grinder, that's the result that you get. So it's very, very nasty. And some of these don't even survive their first mission. There is an interesting quote by Lothar Günther Buchheim. He is the man who wrote the account, which was then later on turned into the film Das Boot. So he was a member of a propaganda company, and he spent a number of months on a U-boat, and then he wrote about this, and that was after the war then turned into this book. And he said, so talking of U-boat people that fell for Germany, he said that's completely the wrong term. because these were not men. He said these were children. You had 19-year-old engineers. You had 20-year-old U-boat commanders. And then he said, and these did not fall for Germany. They were drowned like cats in a wet sack, which I think is pretty nasty, but sums it up quite nicely, because I think dying in a U-boat, in a submarine, whatever nationality you have, is a particularly nasty way to go, I think.
No question about that. That is, of course, the serious side of all this intellectually interesting history. But of course, there's that tragic human component, not only for those U-boat crews who drowned or suffocated, but of course for their victims as well. The crews of the merchant ships and the Allied warships who had an unenviable fate, drowning or with all the burning oil on the surface and so on and so forth. Listeners out there, I won't carry on about that, but I do think it's important. We talked a lot about abstract things like numbers and technology. We've always got to add that human element into the story as well. Matthias, is there anything that you want to, another log you want to throw on the fire, anything you want to add before I close things out here with a little summary of our episode for today?
Just a very, very short comment. I think I've said this before in a different podcast. Coming back to the last point that you raised, I think in many ways and respects, the unsung heroes of the Second World War are the guys from the merchant navy or navies. I think that is, they get forgotten so often. And if you just think what they had to do and had to endure, yes, they don't get enough credit for this, I think.
A well-deserved shout out to the merchant marine. Maybe we'll do an episode on merchant marine one day. I think that might be interesting as well. So, folks, if you're still with us, thank you for listening. We have tried to plot out the grand lines of the U-boat war throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, from its idiosyncratic beginnings with a handful of U-boats to the conquest of France and the happy times against the disadvantaged British, to then the more or less turkey shoot when the Americans joined the war, which all gets caught up by the relentless march of Allied organization, production capacity, tactical expertise, air power, and of course, technological superiority, which plays a decisive role. And as of mid-1943, the Allies have definitively gotten the upper hand in the U-boat war. And that's the story of the U-boat war for today. Let us know what you thought of this episode, listeners at home. Leave us a comment, send us an email, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Now I can go back to the techno hall and say, "Das Boot, do, go, because that's what you do, apparently." Yeah.
I am a techno fan.
Oh my God, really?
Fan. Yes.
Yes. So you should have stayed in Berlin then. Mm-hmm.
That's why I had to get out, actually. But anyway.